Oh, can everyone hear and see me okay?
Yes, to both.
Uh, POIs verbally will not be looking at the chat. Starting in three, two, one. Your mental health is not necessarily dictated by if you love yourself. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I don't think mental health is generally universal. So even if it's an important part, even if opposition stand up here and do however many minutes of explanations as to why self-love is important for some individuals, I just don't think mental health generally is universal and therefore should not have a narrative behind it that is universal. A couple of things in this speech. First of all, framing and then numerable arguments. First of all, in framing, two things. One, what is the counterfactual under Arse of the House? We can accept, and there can be discourse as to why self-love is an important component for mental health, not even for a specific disorder or a specific problem people face, but just generally it is something that you can do, it is an approach you can take to improve your mental health. But I think the counterfactual is a lot more individualized. It's where you try and figure out for yourself, with your friends, with your therapist, with those around you, what your problems are. And the opposition may stand up and be like, oh, but that's incredibly difficult because you're leaving people without a gateway. I think it is not that difficult in a lot of cases because a lot of people around you have been through the same problems. But also, I'd much rather people maybe take a bit longer to find a pathway that is good for them and a conclusion and an outcome that they want, rather than being forced into the wrong thing, rather than being forced into a pathway which ultimately does not solve their problems, but makes them think they should be solving their problems, gives them incredible guilt and shame, and actively worsens their mental health. So even it's more difficult under our side of the house, given that mental health under either side of the house is not an easy fucking thing, I would much rather we take the long path, but ultimately get to the best outcome. Second of all, let's frame what necessary means, because I think necessary means quite a few things. I think it means that this is the most important thing on your mental health. So therefore, it must be a prerequisite before you're able to advance on your journey to improve your mental health in either way. Yes, there can be other things you can do under opposition, but this needs to be the first thing, or you're never going to have the best mental health you can unless you do this. You're not succeeding without it. I think this changes people's actions in two ways. A, it means they prioritize self-love because it's perceived as the most important, but also perceived as the thing that is going to give them the biggest step forward possible because it's something that's necessary, something that everyone around them is telling them they should do. But B, that they should have made significant leaps when they do access self-love. So even if under opposition, that people are able to do this, and this does improve them somewhat, I think there's a lot of emphasis on it, which means that people feel like they should have improved massively. We'll get into why that is harmful later. On to the first argument then, on how this individualizes mental health and the journey of improving yourself. Why is this the case? Two reasons. A, definitionally, self-love is something only you can improve. It does not matter what conditions you exist in, doesn't matter who you interact with, what other people say. Self-love is definitionally what you feel about yourself. Especially with the bad comments that are thrown around you or negative people in your life. It is about you overcoming these and loving you for yourself. Definitionally, and this is basic analysis whatsoever, the most basic analysis whatsoever, is only you can do this. But B, I think this is using an excuse by other people around you to evade responsibility and avoid giving you help, especially for the people that maybe care for you to a certain extent, but are struggling with their own problems, so need to focus on them, or are just too busy in their lives to give you that much help. Or for the bad people in your lives, this is a thing and a weapon they use to be like, actually, I am not the problem. You just need to love yourself. All these comments I'm saying about you, whether it be making fun of your weight or your attractiveness, etc., are true. This is just about you actually accepting those and loving you yourself. I think what this means is it puts the onus on the individual to improve. It says that only you can go on this journey and only you can improve. I think it's incredibly harmful because mental health does not fucking work that way. You, first of all, often have many structural outside factors which you need to improve on. We'll get on this later. But I also just think as an individual, you need support. You need someone to be in a back and forth with, to discuss their issues with, to discuss what you need to do forward. You need active support. Maybe that's if you're a single mother, actually finding a relative to take care of the kids for a bit so you can focus on yourself for a little bit. I think when it says self-love, it's something you can do internally in your own time and you do not need anyone else's help. That sort of onus puts a lot of pressure on the individual and isolates them from the rest of the world. On to the second argument then on how this invalidates every single other problem and issue people face in their mental health. Because panel, self-love is not the universal solution to improving your mental health. There are numerous other problems. Some are biological in terms of PTSD, some are societal. Maybe you're placed under incredible burnout because you need to work work three jobs to be able to raise your family. Maybe they are directly external in terms of if you're in a toxic or abusive relationship where an individual is actively harming you, and that affects your mental health. Self-love do not solve these problems because they are external to you or they are something that are biological and not about your perception of life. These are not going to be solved by simply being like, I accept who I am, because often they have external problems that you cannot overcome. But also, I just think if you opposition want to stand up and say, yes, people in toxic relationships should just accept that and love the situation they're in, I think that's fundamentally wrong. What this does is it ruins and decreases emphasis on these other issues and on these other problems and says they are not the main one. Therefore, as we said in framing, you should prioritize self-love and this should be the most important thing. But also, given that mental health is a very taxing journey, often you can only aim towards one goal. So you'll do the self-love goal and maybe achieve that to a certain extent and stop there because you think that's the only thing that you need for a base level of comfortable mental health. Before I move on to how this changes individuals and ultimately harms their journey, I'll take a POI from Seal.
Engaging with your case on the way in which prioritization works, it's fair to say that comprehensive narrative still exists. The narrative doesn't have the extent of impact as to just like allow narcissism to proliferate.
Why in and of itself is run to the middle, that's just a stupid case because then you're not going to have anything to stand on. You need to accept that self-love is prioritized in society and is a very, very strong narrative. On to the impacts then on what this does and why this harms people's mental health journey. The first thing is I just think there's less societal and structural help because everyone says the most important thing you should be doing is loving yourself. We don't need to solve these structural issues. We don't need to create abuse helplines. We don't need to solve the poverty problem for mental health or give help for those who are experiencing poverty specifically for mental health because that's not the main reason they're experiencing mental health problems. But secondly, I think you feel a certain level of guilt, shame, and failure at the point to which you're not succeeding in your mental health journey and you're not feel like you're getting better, but you're constantly told you are because you are maybe actually achieving a certain level of self-love, assuming opposition at their best. But that's not actually improving you because that's not the root problem. Therefore, you feel like you're failing, you feel like you're not actually helping yourself, and you're constantly stuck in this loop which you cannot escape. But third of all, I think that actively in a lot of cases worsens your mental health, especially when there are active things that you should be improving on and there are active decisions you should be making that are external to you, but you just never make them. So therefore, you're stuck in that toxic relationship for longer. Maybe you're stuck eating unhealthily for longer, and that's not something you should be doing, and you should be actively improving on those facts. But when it's focused on self-love, you do not. For all these reasons, so proud to propose.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for a fine speech. To start the opposition bench, leader of opposition, whenever you're ready.
Yep, just a second, setting my timer up, setting the laptops. All right, I'll take POIs from closing government. I'll also take clarifications from OG if they have any. I'll just start in a second. All right. 3, 2, 1. One clarification before I get started into framing. If opening government is correct, that this narrative on our side pushes that self-love is the most important thing or the most necessary thing, even though the motion doesn't say it and they don't do it, even if they're willing to bite that trade-off, they also have to accept that on their side, other aspects which constitute mental health are necessarily prioritized. So either you can prioritize self-love or you can prioritize other components of mental health, which I'm going to frame in my speech. They have to bite that trade-off if they're pushing that burden on us. Otherwise, this is not an equal burden push, and therefore the debate does not take place. What are the components of mental health, and what is it primarily that determines this? I think generally it's love, which exists on two levels. Firstly, it's internal, which is self-love. Secondly, it's external. Love from other people, getting loved by them and loving them. Yeah. So getting validation from others and providing validation to them, so on and so forth. This is necessarily, these are the two components probably of love, which allow you to feel happy mentally, which allow you to deal with sadness in your life and feel satisfied. The comparative then that government bench defends in this debate is a world where this is where self-love is not a necessary component and only external love becomes the necessary component for how your mental health is going to be judged. So for example, this looks like how well people love you. whether you're a person who's interactive with people, whether you're a person who people like to hang out with in a party, whether you're someone who gets that validation, so on and so forth. Necessarily, that's what Gov has to defend in this debate. Then one extremist response before I go into framing. First, I think the main chunk of the case from OG is that self-love leads to isolation and you don't get community support. I just have one response here, which is that people on our side, even if this narrative prioritizes self-love, can bond over self-love. Yeah, yeah. So for example, maybe self-love for all of us is going into a debate tournament and having fun in it. And we are just trying to love ourselves and become better and have better mental health by debating. But we are engaging in this community together. Our main incentive might not be to love each other. Our main incentive might be to love ourselves. But there's a common ground that exists here. That common ground is that all of us are trying to find that self-love. And in order to do that, there are common activities that you can pursue. So on our side, community is not that exclusive. You can go ahead and access community because you can combine and take part with them in the process to find self-love, and therefore bonding with community can happen. This takes the main fulcrum of the OG case out. Now, what am I going to prove to you? I think the first thing that I'm going to prove to you quite simply is why is their capacity to pursue self-love for people and why this can take place. I think there are three specific mechanisms for this. The first mechanism for this is that the propagators of this narrative are likely to go ahead and ensure preemptively that people feel that they can achieve self-love. Yeah. What they do within this specifically is just crowding out negative memories, crowding out negative narratives, crowding out negative examples. So they reinforce your positive bias. They tell you that self-love is a process which is achievable. So there might be many people who fail in this process, but these are not the stories you consume, because the propagators of this narrative, probably mental health scientists or mental health researchers or mental health doctors, necessarily want you to buy into this narrative. They want you to opt in, and therefore they have an incentive to propagate positive stories and reinforce your optimism bias so that you believe that you can go ahead and love yourself. That's the first reason. The second reason is that the state pushes this as well. The idea of capitalistic individualism, the fact that if you get rich enough, the fact that if you work hard enough, you can go ahead and access your free will. You can do things and get access to hedonistic pleasures which can make your life better. So this idea is also pushed out by an actor which is very capable to influence you. And finally, this does not have to happen in a single day, right? You don't have to achieve self-love in one day. You can take baby steps. You can have incremental steps before you reach the apex, the peak of the mountain. What does this look like? This probably looks like you can just start with 5 push-ups a day, even if you're like a really unfit person and you're still loving yourself. You're still trying. The reason for why this is a likely characterization is because people who are propagating this narrative, mental health scientists, other people that I described earlier, once again, have an incentive for you to not opt out of this narrative. Yeah. They know that if they push the narrative that you have to achieve this in a single day, you have to achieve this effectively all at once, people will feel discouraged. People will feel demotivated. People will feel that they're just not able to love themselves, that they're not good enough. And therefore, pushing this idea is unstrategic for the propagators of this narrative. Therefore, they push it in such a way that you can take incremental steps. Even if your progress is low, it is still progress, which counts in the process of self-love. This is how this narrative manifests, and this is why we can achieve self-love on our side in every scenario. Now, second question in the speech, why is the comparative much worse, and what are the harms government have to deal with, and why do we solve those problems? Firstly, on government bench, you chase external validation for mental health. Why? Because that is the component of love that you value. You want people to value yourself. What do you do in this process? The first thing that you do is that you sacrifice a lot to go ahead and get buy-in from other people. You want to go ahead and get their validation. Therefore, you're willing to go ahead and adjust to their demands. So for example, this looks like a mother specifically going ahead and taking care of the child and not asking for help because she wants her husband to love her. And therefore, she does not want to go ahead and remove that aspect of the couple love that exists, which can make her mental life better. The comparative is that on our side, you don't really have to sacrifice things because it's not just about external people loving you. It's about you loving yourself. Therefore, you can access your agency. You can do things more on our side. You don't necessarily have to sacrifice these things on our side. But secondly, and this is very crucial, there's a suppression of identity that takes place on government bench. So for example, the LGBTQ community, when they have to go ahead and get validation from external people, they can't come out the closet. They can't go ahead and talk about their identity. But before I explain this, closing government. Okay, nothing.
Why are you likely able to change like what you're doing such that you can get sort of validation within yourself, but not still depend on other people giving it to you?
because I gave a bunch of reasons for why this narrative is efficacious. On our side, we don't have to defend that you need validation from others because self-love is prioritized as opening government claim. If OG is correct, on our side, all you need to do to get a good mental health is focus on self-love. I've explained why you can do it. Finally, on the comparative, there's a suppression of identity because you necessarily have to go ahead and appease people. Therefore, accessing your identity, particularly when it can offend conservatives, for example, is less likely going to happen on government bench. LGBTQI community don't necessarily do this. On our side, it's all about identifying what makes you feel happy. And therefore, on the comparative, you're much more likely to go ahead and explore your identity, do things like coming out of the closet and taking pride in that identity because that makes you feel happy. What does this prove? This proves to you that the comparative is bad. On efficacy, what ends up happening on government? On government, the comparative is simple. No matter how much buy-in and external validation you get from people, it is not sustainable. People are unpredictable. Their behaviors change. Maybe they love you for a little while, but maybe you do something which pisses them off. On the comparative, self-love is eternal. It sticks with you, and therefore you're able to have better mental health. For all those reasons, opening opposition.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for a fine speech and invite Deputy Prime Minister to summarise the opening government whenever they're ready.
Hi, can I check that I'm visible and audible?
Yes to both.
I might probably leave after the round. Like the time zone's really bad, so I'm so sorry. But if I drop out, like that's the reason why. POI's verbally, so just unmute yourself. Opening opposition constructs a case that we never ran and pushes that to be the case that we necessarily defend, absent of wanting to actually respond to the heart of what Callum's case is. The first thing is I'll explain why we don't need to, our comparative is an external validation and external love. I think this would then frame out the second argumentation in its entirety. The first is that they want to say that if necessarily this is the case, that we need to prioritize other aspects. I don't think this necessarily is the burden. I think it's Op's burden to explain why we want to have this narrative. I think it's fine in place of that, they need to explain why other narratives would supersede to say that this is the necessary thing that happens. Rather, our counterfactual is quite simple, that there isn't a specific thing that's a necessary condition for your mental health to necessarily improve, but likely it's highly individualized, i.e., for some people, we can imagine a world where self-love is the most important thing in order to get better mental health, but for some people, it is different. For some people, it's being able to cope with the loss of a loved one, not because you don't love yourself, but because you're entirely attached to them and aren't able to move on. But second, the reason if you don't buy that, it doesn't really matter within the round, is that I think narratives of self-love persist anyway, just without the attachment of it being necessary to your mental health. I.e., in this day and age where people are overworked, I think concepts of self-love such as don't be too hard on yourself, sometimes you fall flat on our expectations, or put others first, but put yourself first too sometimes, because you also matter, don't necessarily need an attachment towards it being a necessary precondition to your mental health, but are narratives that persist today, especially in the 21st century, where conversations about, for example, tiger parenting, familial structures, and the overburden of work, for example, are necessary discussions. Hence why we don't think that is the necessary comparative. We don't need to defend specifically prioritizing one thing. But if we did, we will prioritize, for example, saying that seeking professional help is an important component of your assessing your mental health and being able to overcome it. I think that frames out the second argumentation because they wanted to entirely assert that that's what we necessarily need to defend. The second thing I'll do is the next two things I'll do is first, I'll explain why strategically Callum's case is superior, but second, I'll introduce an extension of the existing case on how it makes it harder for other individuals to self-reflect and be held accountable for the actions that cause other people mental ailments. The first thing that Callum talks to you about is how people likely internalize these structures and the blanket narrative does not cover for them. Note that strategically, it is not opposition on both houses to prove that self-love sometimes is necessarily going to help some people. They overwhelmingly to explain why a majority of people that this is the necessary precondition and they get better. Because in these circumstances, in these circumstances, the all opening government case is not to say that no self-love is not important in all cases, just like it's not cross-applicable in a majority. We identify 3 groups of individuals that's unresponded to. We said number 1, for individuals where other factors are far more integral to why they have mental ailments, i.e., the environment that you're in. Perhaps you're in a toxic familial structure where you feel a lot of pressure. So the problem isn't that you don't love yourself, but the environment that necessarily chokes you down. Second, maybe it's a lack of familial love. So perhaps it's not the problem that you don't love yourself, but maybe that the self-love that you derive is the only love that you've ever known, and you've never been able to have any external validation in your life. Or third, that perhaps you lack support structures. So the reason why your mental health is failing is because every time there's an obstacle in life, you need to deal with it alone, and you don't have other people to ground you. For these individuals, opposition makes it far worse. We explain in twofold. Either number 1, that in the process of trying to prioritize and love themselves far more, because it's the most proximate thing or the most integral thing to unlock other benefits, they are feel worse in the process. Because even if they love themselves, they don't solve the root structure and the causes, or don't identify the right reasons as to why they aren't, or why they are mentally affected or more mentally ill. In that process, they feel guilty because their mental health is not improving despite the actions that they take. But even in their best case, where you don't suffer these mental harms as a result of your active failure to solve your mental ailments, I think it's that it takes far too long to come to that conclusion, or far too long to overcome it in the end. I.e., you spend far too much time going to therapists and them teaching you how to love yourself, or you yourself internalizing these narratives, that you suffer the effects of this mental illness longer. But second, for groups of individuals that where prioritizing themselves is exactly the reason why they feel mentally ill, i.e., individuals who feel they are too narcissistic, other people who feel that they are too selfish, and other people dislike them as a result of that. For these individuals, loving themselves is the exact cause as to why they feel this mental ailment, and it's likely the opposite that they need to necessarily prioritize, that is externalizing other things, etc. Or thirdly, even if self-love was very important for this specific people, and this takes up again at their best, we would argue that loving yourself is, even if it's a necessary or an important component, often come until other external factors are resolved, because oftentimes other external factors exacerbate the current mental state that you're in and that you're dealing with. If your family member just passed away, even if you already did not love yourself, likely you're far more preoccupied with trying to cope with the grief and the loss that happened within your family. And I think it's extremely hard to form positive views and associations with yourself when other external factors likely distract from your mind in the first place and divert away your emotional bandwidth altogether. Which means that the reason why it's harder, therefore, to identify yourself as a problem is that often you are harsh with yourself. It's quite normalized for you to not love yourself, but external things are new, they are fresh, they are raw and scary, which is why they take precedence in your mind. So even on your best case where mental health or self-love was incredibly important, in order to access that gateway, you have to solve for external issues that are far more proximate and urgent. Before that, closing, is there one? Opening. None. I think the importance of this argument is
So
is
it is not. Are you taking? Okay. Mental health is the necessary way to communicate the idea of self-love to people and get them to love themselves. There's no other alternative way. If you say there's alternatives, explain them.
Yeah. The point is that even if you tell people to love themselves, I can't love you for you. The end of the day is that you need to solve that for yourself, regardless of even if other people support you to do that. The implication of this argument is simple. Our pathway to victory does not require us to disprove that no one is helped via loving yourself. The point is there are very large groups and a majority of people that are left out via this narrative that either makes them feel worse in the process or take too long to overcome the process. The last thing is a flip, an extension material, which is that if it is the case that people are told that self-love is the key to solving mental health, I think this makes it worse and people don't reflect on their actions. I.e., it's not that I'm the problem in a toxic relationship, it's that other people don't love themselves enough to take them out of that situation. Other people don't love themselves, and it's not my actions that cause them to be mentally ill. The reason why this is important is that this causes the agents that cause mental harms to either be not aware or not held accountable for their actions because they reflect onto other people. This weighs because if you cause less harm to other people, it requires less mental harm on their part to necessarily solve. You have no accountability structures and no ability to overcome illnesses that aren't actually stemming from a lack of self-esteem.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his fine speech and invite the Deputy of Opposition to summarize top half whenever they're ready.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yes, to both.
Great. Krishang speaking second on opening opposition. Wait, timer. I'll start speech in 3, 2, 1. The first fatal mistake that opening government makes in this debate is not accepting their comparative, because they never explain what the absence of self-love is going to look. All other things they talk about are also compatible with self-love and can exist even on our side. So if on our side, mental health is made up of 4 components, A, B, C, and D, with D being self-love, they need to defend by just having A, B, and C with the absence of self-love is going to be something that's good. Here, absent rebuttal to our characterization, it should stand, which is that in the absence of self-love, it is very, very likely that the kind of narrative that propagates as to how you can have good mental health is the narrative of give as much love to other people as you can, become a pushover, and try your best to get as much love from other people as you possibly can. Because the gap that is being filled within this kind of narrative of how you can have good mental health is the same. Where do you feel more loved? Where do you feel more cared for? And we think that in the absence of self-love, you still need to find a way to feel loved, because that's an intrinsic need. So they need to achieve it through another way. We tell you that that other way is to achieve external validation through some means or other. This is bad for the, I'm just going to continue what Abdul already explained in the first speech before I continue responses. That we think that the kind of validation that you're able to get from other people is simply not sustainable, which means your mental health, which should be the metric of this debate, is much more fucked on their side. The first reason that Abdul already gives you is other people are unpredictable. You don't know what their intentions are. You don't know if they're being honest with you. You don't know if they're trying to utilize you. You don't know if they really mean the validation and the compliments that they're actually giving to you. Because of this level of doubt that you will always have, because you don't completely trust another person, this will not persist. On our side, well, you probably trust yourself, or at least your opinion of it. Secondly, we think that the mechanism of the hedonic treadmill specifically kicks in, which means that even in the best case of government, in the absence of self-love, when you're chasing external validation, you're giving yourself away, you're listening to everyone's trauma dumping just to make sure that people pay attention to you. If that happens, then we think that even if you do begin to get some validation, this validation will get very old very fast, because we run on like the simple hormone of dopamine, and our body gets desensitized to dopamine over and over and over multiple iterations. So over a period of time, it will take a much bigger level of validation to get you the same level of like kick that you potentially want to get out of this at a biological level, as you initially did with the beginning sort of validation. So you chase more validation, but the utility you get out of it is the same. This is why the absence of self-love, chasing external validation, is a stupid claim from them. Not a stupid claim, but a comparative that they needed to defend, which they did not, which is a harmful comparative for the mental health of every stakeholder. Now I'm going to engage with their case point by point. The first argument they have is that this leads to the individualization of people, and the biggest harm that they're able to derive out of this, the basic reason that they have is that the definition of self-love as self and stuff, but the harm that they derive out of this is, oh, maybe you get more isolated. I don't know why this is true. I think Abdul already beats this in first speech, where we're able to explain to you that self-love for me could just be not being productive and doing work that will get me money, but wasting time competitively yapping in front of all of you fine ladies and gentlemen. If this is what self-love means to me, I can still find a community of other people who also find self-love in the same kind of mechanism of self-love or on the same platforms. So we don't think you're ever isolated. The second thing that they say is that I think this is potentially a good argument also, because so I'll preemptively respond to CG if they want to run it, which is that the self-love narrative comes at the opportunity cost of other narratives, such as going to therapy and things of that sort. The problem with this is, let's say, I don't even need to say, I do have ADHD and anxiety and depression. For me, self-love is being regular with my medicines, and self-love for me is being regular with my therapy appointments. The point of all of this is, and the frame that OG never contends with, is the idea that self-love is something that's inherently subjective. It's inherently malleable. And the idea is that everyone can take the experience of self-love and at least personally feel like they're making incremental steps no matter what they are doing in their own lives. If it is something that people are able to determine that this feeds our own purposes or our own interests, and they categorize it as self-love, we think that's a win on our side, because it reinforces the narrative of self-worth, self-love, and makes you work better. I'll take CG. Yeah, CG.
So this narrative has also made people actively against the sort of basis of like mental health and caring for themselves, insofar as it becomes very easily co-opted by anyone who can just claim that they love themselves.
Oh, okay. I mean, it's an integral part of your mental health. It's not like the only integral part of your mental health. I would argue that it should, and the scientific consensus around this and the qualified consensus around this, every single researcher will tell you that your mental health is a balance of your biological needs and like your environment and stuff like that. Because of this, we don't think this cost of other kinds of like narratives or good narratives really comes. Prove that in your speech. Moving on. Third thing that they end up saying is that, and I think this is potentially a venomous argument, is to say that opting into self-love can be symmetric. Because OJ says that, oh, maybe there's other narratives on our side that encourage self-love. Panel, the intuition I want to give to you is that think of self-love as a bitter pill. If you want to feed your dog a bitter pill, you will have to wrap it up in a piece of salami. And the piece of salami is mental health. We believe that this is the best way to spread the narrative of self-love to as many people as we possibly can and get them to justify the good, positive baby steps that they take in their everyday lives within the overall ambit of mental. So with this, we flip the GovBench's impact of therapy because we think that when you take these baby steps, and for a month, if you've taken many, many baby steps, you did 5 push-ups a day, 6 push-ups a day, 7 push-ups a day, maybe at the end of the month, you will be willing to join a gym. Or maybe at the end of the month, you'll be willing to go out to jog, which means that when you keep upscaling your level of self-love, you're also going to be able to opt into the healthy other narratives that exist on their side. Because of this, we don't think that self-love is bad for you as a person or bad for society. What's my extension in this round? It's not very long, but it's very simple. I think that hurt people hurt people. We think that when you're not able to express this self-love or you're not able to love yourself or make time for yourself, what you end up doing is you use your most proximate people as an outlet for this kind of aggression, and you end up hurting other people in the process. Like the simple intuition for this is like if a very hardworking single mother does not take out the time for herself to go out on a spa weekend, it is way more likely that she's going to end up being harsher to her children over the weekend just because of the overall sacrifices that you have made. So the method that we're going to give for this is that when you have to love other people, you have to sacrifice your own interests, which still hurts you on some level, but you're trying to justify it by thinking that, oh, my mental health will eventually be better. But these sacrifices hurt, and these sacrifices keep piling up. Eventually, when you feel like these sacrifices are not worth it, you end up creating negative harms on the other people that surround you. Because of this, we think that in the absence of self-love, the way you try to fulfill your mental health is to potentially use other people as outlets for your frustration, is to fulfill Napoleon complexes in like university classrooms or school classrooms where you're really mean to your students or whatever, because you feel like you sacrificed so much for them already. Because of all these things, we think that the narrative on their side isn't just neutral, it's actively harmful. So the comparative that closing government now needs to defend is why a world where you're trying to chase external validation constantly is better than a world where you try to love yourself, create your own validation. Even if it's small, you will still think it's validation. Very proud of.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Deputy of Opposition for a fine speech. Everyone, top half's been a good debate so far. Time for the back half. Member of Government, whenever you're ready.
Right. I'll call on a POI. But feel free to like raise your hand or whatnot. Just please don't verbal. The first problem with OG is they don't actually give us a meaningful comparative in terms of what mental health advocacy would otherwise look like. The first thing I want to do, also to add on to OG, is to explain what this narrative actually looks like, how these sorts of things are communicated and then internalized, where the vast majority of people do receive messaging when it comes to loving themselves, and why that's probably unlikely to be productive or probably going to be very good. The first thing I want to say is that narratives and like sort of like messaging around loving yourself have existed far before mental health made it like an integral component within a narrative, right? And notably, I think self-love tends to platform a lot of poor advocates or incentivizes people to unreasonably respond to their situations. Notably, the people who are most sort of able to communicate and able to kind of demonstrate their ability to love themselves are those with the strongest sort of personalities. They're people who are confident in themselves. They're people who are expected and charismatic in their own sort of identities. They're people who can identify even things like past struggles and say, oh yeah, like I had to go through all of these things. I really suffered in terms of like being able to come to terms with myself. And then now I'm, so super like kind of successful at these things. And the reason that this is the case is that by far the greatest sort of advocacy when it comes to like self-love tends to be on social media, which is just to say that by far the greatest sort of platform for a lot of sort of like self-love and sort of like people sharing these sorts of experiences. But secondly, as decentralized platforms become more and more normalized for things like therapy and mental care, it is very, very very easy to be like, oh, like this is kind of the starting step. Like this is how I like kind of went to love myself. The problem with OG here is that they say, well, people don't take the steps to further address their mental ailments and the structural sort of like roots of a lot of these sorts of issues. But I do, while I think that that's a reasonable claim, I think it's seriously unproven out of OG, which is one, they're reliant on saying that people then try to do this, i.e., loving themselves. They probably fail or insufficiently address it, and then they give up on solving other mental illnesses. And I think OO has pretty strong pushback to say either one, the process of doing this is probably like at the very can coincide with also taking care of your mental illness, which I don't think they proved to me why these necessarily exist in a form of trade-off. But second, I think OG doesn't prove to me why people are likely to be so derailed or unable to then meet some basic sort of threshold of being able to love themselves, other than saying, well, they don't fix their problems. I think it's far beyond that, right? The reason that people often can't love themselves is that the basis for a lot of these things tend to be ones that they can actively perform, right? So actively every single day that I kind of like showcase to like the external world, for example, that I am like making steps to becoming more confident within myself, that I am sort of like putting myself out there in a much more like meaningful way, that I am doing XYZ things, it dictate the extent to which I internally even can feel like I'm comfortable with the identity that I'm upholding and the extent to which I like do love myself, right? And here's the difference. The reason for why you get quick and easy solutions and race to the bottom sort of effects on their side of the house is because advocacy about loving yourself already exists, and mental health advocacy is then polluted in the competitive landscape by actively making this a necessary component or actively even trying to like compete with these types of depictions, right? Because broadly, people generally feel like they need sort of a like necessary sort of like I don't know, reason to kind of love themselves, and that is a prerequisite, or that is an ability for them to address their sort of mental cares, right? And notably, a lot of sort of like influencers or a lot of like sort of conservative like media rhetoric is very easily able to co-opt this by saying, well, here are very easy ways to love yourself, like XYZ things, right? And I think the problem here is that in the likely alternative, the necessary components of mental health are just taking active steps to learn about the nature of mental suffering, i.e., to take care of yourself, those around you, and take active steps to then reduce people's exposure to a lot of these mental risks. And notably, these are significantly higher commitment things because they're things that require cognitive, emotional, and social kind of like aspects or like considerations of your life that define what that mental qualitative experience even is, right? And historically, mental health has always been about like kind of self-reflection, doing active things that have like put you in front of people who can very easily sort of like communicate this information and make your life easier, right? And so that means that you learn significantly about your flaws. You're willing to admit sort of like really vulnerable and like bad things. And I think a lot of these sorts of things are ones that you actively brush aside the more that you're taught to internalize very quick content that tells you that you are like a lovable person, that you ought to like love yourself. I think it very quickly brushes aside the ability for you to then process the reasons for why you don't in status quo, and it puts the onus on you then to perform a degree of confidence or a degree of care that you already have within yourself before reaching any sort of like internal conclusion that probably would lead you to do that. And I think it's very easy to be confident, for example, when you're the guy in the workplace, but it's far harder when you're a woman who is dealing with the insecurities and feelings of inadequacy that are sort of legitimately like based on the way in which other people are giving you sort of like invalidation, are based in terms of like the types of insecurities that you naturally have, right? And so notably what OO I think meaningfully proves is that some people probably are able to just meaningfully kind of perform or like at the very least do love themselves. But the problem is the people who are most legitimately able to do these are the ones who can very easily refuse to do so. And OO's comparative here is just to say, well, this is actually not that bad because now when you're like a woman who's being oppressed, you can very easily just say, I don't need the validation of my husband who's forcing me into childcare. That is not probably the case. Yeah, I'll take you, OO.
For that woman that you're talking about, self-love doesn't need to look like yelling at your boss on day one. It can look like just stepping out of your shell and asking for a leave a day early or asking to take a half day or something like that. These small steps still add up.
Cool. Yeah, that's super fair. One, I think the ability for you to advocate for yourself is probably one that you have a very good ability to make judgments on, insofar as these are internal desires that you've experienced every day. You have evolutionary reasons to prioritize your well-being. You have like, I don't know, just epistemic access to these desires. I think at that point, it is probably far less likely that you feeling like you have to be confident in doing these things is going to be the tipping point, right? But notably, I think you're just far less likely to be able to do like a lot of those sorts of things. So even if it's not like yelling at your boss, which is not what I'm claiming you need to do, even taking active steps away from your sort of like husband, for example, are actively things that you feel more sort of like pressure to do. And notably, the aversion for confidence or whatever is actively like I think good in a lot of cases because being like overconfident is also bad, I think in a lot of cases. But it's not just that like confidence leads to bad traits, but rather that confidence is actively punished in a lot of cases, right? So for example, black women are actively far more likely to be discriminated against when they're confident. When you glorify things like coming out, you create an expectation to adhere to a lot of these things. I think it's fine to say that people are insecure, or I think it's fine that people feel inadequate insofar as they're likely to take far more productive steps on our side of the house. Very proud to propose.
Cool. I'd like to thank Member of Government for a fine speech. Invite Member of Opposition to commence the case for closing opposition whenever they're ready.
Am I audible?
And visible, yes.
Okay. I'm just gonna set up my timer. Let me just put this up there. Okay. All right. I'll do all of it in the chat so POI's there. Okay. I am going to begin in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think we have to, at the end of the day, engage with what a narrative actually is, what a narrative actually does, and what a narrative can actually accomplish. First off, let's talk about the narrative itself. I think what we're talking about here is very simple when we think of the comparatives and counterfactuals. This narrative says that mental health has the necessary component of loving yourself, and to achieve good mental health, you actively have to love yourself for that. Prioritization framework here. Narratives don't change the world. There are many narratives that come in place. We have to examine saliency. We have to examine where this actually works and what the scope of this actually is. 2 things on the scope. I think it shapes our perception of what mental health actually looks like, and it naturally redefines what good mental health looks like. I think the comparative here then is that loving yourself becomes a periphery that isn't actually substantive to it. I think mental health as a whole is changed and co-opted into other narratives and other processes that explicitly exist to serve external institutions and external validation in and of itself. I think this is in and of itself what you do when you say something is necessary for it. It's a pre-axiomatic function that is necessary to achieve in order to grow from it. I think fundamentally, the saliency of this narrative is most felt in institutions that prioritize mental health and in societies and cultures that do that. I think this is especially within institutions that have actively shown in the past years that they want to have better mental health standards. Therefore, when we are considering what we define mental health to be, we have to talk about the impact here. And I'm going to explicitly engage with this and look at the way in which mental health itself changes. And these actors who have the most buy-in change and what the impacts of this are on all sides of the house. The counterfactual to the extent at which mental health might exist in different forms on either side of the house, I think is something that opening half goes back and forth on. At the end of the day, mental health still exists, but the definition changes. At the end of the day, countervailing narratives still exist, but the way in which they interact with this narrative changes, and therefore this is the comparative we have to naturally go with. I think this also changes the way in which other actors who care about mental health operate, and we also have to engage with the way in the world in and of itself will engage with these natural consequences. I think naturally, some things that are generated by the prospect of loving yourself is that you are actively going to be prioritizing yourself, your both physical, mental state, you're actively going to be deterministic of your internal value system by the way in which you are actively pushing, by the way in which you perceive yourself and not based on external metrics. I think this is natural with this. I'm going to this clashes innately with this case of narcissism coming out of opening half. I think even if I take them at their best, I think it's innate to recognize that even outside of mental health, there are people who who love themselves considerably. This case exists on both sides of the house. Narcissism, overconfidence, all these things exist. But the saliency here is that it's most salient in situations in which people are actively working towards better mental health. I'm going to give you specificity on the other narratives that combat this and the way in which we talk about this to begin with. I think the here and now is not a hedonic treadmill, which both sides on opening half and what O gives as their primary impact is here to counteract this. The innate narratives that counteract self-love exist within biology in and of itself. Humans are social creatures. We innately crave certain social and external validations. We set ourselves up in hierarchies, and therefore we always have that external actor. The external actor is innately unstable simply because it's based on the perspectives of other people. Your life then, when you're engaging in mental health, then becomes dependent upon other people's opinions and other people's perceptions. Other people's perceptions in and of themselves are not objective. They don't have a good way of understanding the complexity of your life. They don't have the experiences that you do. Self-love puts the judgment in the hands of the most proximate actor and the actor who has the right to act as a judge. And that is the person who lives the life themselves. I want to engage here on the fact that certain people are going to overvalue themselves. I think if you are to the extent at which you are so confident that self-love becomes blinding, you are going to be self-confident on either side of the house. I think the more salient impact here are people who are more affected by external validations and means of external validation to then reorient their worldview and their perspective. I want to call out the case on capacity here as well. I think when we look at capacity and we recognize and understand that in order to buy into this narrative, you have to care about mental health yourself. Again, if you don't care about mental health, you're not going to care about what's necessary to it. We have to look at the main people who are impacted by narratives of mental health and the way in which they engage with this. First off, this manifests in two unique cases that opening half doesn't tell you. One is of small scope, but very high magnitude, and those are people with severe mental health concerns. And one is a large impact for many people in the way in which we all engage with mental health, and why this is a logically prior mechanism you have to engage in order to achieve mental health benefits. First on the fact that many mental health illnesses, when we look at depression, when we look at anxiety, often rely on this innate devaluation of self. Anxiety talks about the inability to deal with things yourself. Loving yourself tells you that you're a capable individual. Depression deals with the fact that you don't like the circumstances of your life. And the most negative impacts of these are then the negative impacts that everyone wants to talk about in this round, where you talk about the way in which you treat yourself. Loving yourself resolves this specifically because it allows you to understand that you in and of yourself are not beholden to these narratives. Therefore, for the achievement of treatment and actual long-term change, especially when you look at things like cognitive behavioral therapy, this is absolutely necessary. This also deals with the OG burden push on why we need to prove that this matters the most. The most salient forms of treatment actively exist by using this and by actively telling you that all those concerns you have that are leading you to be depressed or anxious don't exist. And I also think on the whole, when we look at people, because there has been significant amounts of buy-in with the world at large and institutions and people. I'm also going to give you some unique information on institutions and the way in which this propagates at large. A lot of this round has revolved around this idea of the individual. But when we look at mental health, we see global pushes for it at large and the prioritization of mental health at large. And then when we adapt this mechanism, we are actually able to achieve unique impacts for certain actors and certain groups of people in and of itself in terms of magnitude, weighing out over the individual. That's push on the opening halves and giving you a more salient impact in the way in which society itself reorients it, what it wants and what it demands from people like marginalized communities, or the way in which institutions function and what they prioritize. On part of corporate actors, we've seen this develop. We've seen less pushes for 80-hour work weeks and replacement with these ideas of taking time for yourself and being able to leave work, because burnout is no longer glorified like it is in status quo. Driving yourself to the brink is no longer prioritized like it is in status quo. Rather, taking care of yourself because you love and value yourself enough as an individual to do that is. And anyone that stands in opposition to that is innately criticized. That's another thing. Criticism that actively forces people to do things that are harmful to them, which in status quo have been pushed severely because of the way in which our society works, are taken out. And for people in marginalized communities, this becomes more salient when we look at the way in which women have been taught to behave, women have been taught to act, and the way in which they have been taught to then propagate themselves. Therefore, so proud to oppose.
And I thank the member of opposition for a fine speech, and invite government whip to summarize proposition bench whenever they're ready.
Awesome. Okay, I'll try to engage. I'll ask for POI. Please don't interrupt me. Okay, one second. Alright. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. First thing, I'm going to explain why it's true for a lot of people that they cannot actually change themselves and it's justified to not love yourself. Next, I'm going to go team by team, and then lastly, we explain at pace. Why is it justified? Firstly, I think we vertical on OG because we explain why people are exposed to this narrative in a way that lacks nuance and is like really hard, right? We tell you that, TikTok therapists are unlicensed and they make content that doesn't really respond to the individual people. I think like conversations with friends are also insufficient because your friend might tell you you should love yourself, but most people aren't emotionally vulnerable enough to be super open with them. Lastly, I think it creates unrealistic expectations because you see like really fit athletes on like TikTok saying, "Oh, you should love yourself," and then you like suddenly become really healthy and confident with lots of charisma. Yeah, the narrative implies that this is how you be healthy. Not necessarily that's the first step, but just it's necessary at some point, which means for people who think it's really hard to love themselves, they're unlikely to engage with any sort of healing at all. Why might not people not love themselves? Why is not loving yourself a legitimate claim? I think lots of examples of like mental health issues such as eating disorders, right? It's somewhat like it's a really hard thing to change, and it's really really hard when everything in society tells you that you are ugly and whatever. And I think it's probably legitimate to actually believe this. I think it's really hard to change this whatever. I think this doesn't need to be the first step, but also like body dysmorphia, right? I think this is just clearly justified. A lot of people literally cannot change their bodies, and I think they truly dislike it. Also, I know there's like a lot of self-shame pushed on by community members for things such as like being disabled or being homosexual. People shame on this, and I think for a lot of these people, it's really hard to actually change and start loving yourself. I don't think this should be the first step to mental health. I don't think this should be any step because it makes the entire process look really difficult, given that this is just one step, not that it has to be the first one. Yes, this is why we beat OG just by itself. I'll talk a little bit more later. Response against CG. First of all, they say, oh yeah, we'll just prove what this narrative is. If your counterfactual, CG's counterfactual, is that loving yourself is good but not necessary, then again, this is better on our side because less blanket narratives that lack nuance and are really, really strong are better for like the really vulnerable people who suffer from this. Also, like, are you a licensed psychiatrist? Can you prove that society will be better when people think that this is necessary to be mentally healthy? Is this actually a step that is needed? I think the people that push these narratives are really, really bad and unlicensed, and people likely believe them. For mentally healthy people, yeah, you say yourself, they'll pursue loving themselves anyways. If I'm not depressed and I'm happy and I'm doing fine, I don't have the incentive to pursue mental health goals. I won't interact with this narrative or in the counterfactual, the weaker, like just broad idea that you should love yourself. Either way, for people who do feel depressed, who are like really, really depressed, or try to pursue mental health because they are told that they should do this, then it's really bad for them because now you push on an arbitrary, really hard, and I think just untrue step that they must accomplish that makes it really hard for them to actually, get the benefits. So yeah, weighing against CG is really simple. Maybe you somewhat help the vulnerable, the large amount of population who maybe benefit from this, but because a narrative is just stronger than a broad idea, than the counterfactual without a narrative, you harm those who cannot change their circumstance, who now feel really bad. The impacts, again, are really, really clear. This leads to people not buying into mental health or other forms of support because they see mental health as a entire thing, really hard to access because they cannot do the one link that's really important. Also, it increases the barrier of entry because, again, people have valid reasons to not love themselves that are valid, and also I think just like really, really hard to fix. So even if it's not valid, it's hard to fix. Okay, just rebuilding our case, and then I'll do O. Good versions of self-love narratives are likely to manifest in terms of like movies and discourse, internal biases without this narrative. Why this makes you lose very important buy-in. From the Mike's case, is very simple. It's just that you lose the important buy-in or belief that the movement is being necessary when the big necessary component can also be accessed otherwise. So, why is your mom likely to support self-love narratives if TikTok and random people on the internet are saying self-love? Why will like institutions like focus this? I think you risk not over like empathizing with, deeply understanding the biological nature of these issues. I think you don't do that on side opposition. Secondly, I think this is seems more ridiculous to advocate on, justifying things out of self-love over seeing deeply committing to doing the hard labor of holding yourself your maladaptive thoughts and something you need to fix because they have direct consequences on you and people around you. Thirdly, inconveniencing yourself for others is pretty good. The people who stop doing it on OO are more privileged people who've created far more expectation to adhere to preserving mental health. Response to OO, I'm unclear with their counterfactual. They say, oh, you'll just try to get external love, and like the way you get value is to have as many people love you. Firstly, in the great sport of debate, you need to justify your counterfactual with mechanization. The OG narrative, also they talked about capitalism. I'm so lost. In the absence of this narrative, you need to prove that mental health advocates or just anyone will say, yeah, guys, the way you get validation, the way you be mentally healthy is to have as many people love you as possible. Like, please be so for real. Also, please prove how people interpret this narrative with mechanization. They also tell you that this comes at the opportunity cost of going to other sources like therapy and talking to your friends. Why do I do this? Because this is the counterfactual. You don't do the other sources, and more importantly, Namai tells you people don't actually self-love in good ways. Also, they tell you this narrative will be slow. I don't know why. We prove why it's likely unnuanced and really strong given the financial incentive to do this. In terms of community supports, like, sure, maybe you can find community support and grow, but you're probably not the vulnerable actor that actually matters. I think whether or not this narrative exists, you'll be pretty happy. Anyways, I think gay people in conservative countries exist, right? There's always situations where you cannot come out of the closet and you cannot actually access a lot of the benefits you are. I think you're more likely to feel bad about like not self-loving yourself enough to be confident. I also think this leads to violence, so thank you. On OO, firstly, I think the framing is flawed. Like, narrative should be weighed on aggregate good. You can't win just because the narrative isn't good universally. Secondly, they tell you this necessarily needs to be the first thing. So I don't think they sufficiently prove why this is perceived as the most important thing in healing and being like healthy in mental health. I think we prove this by explaining not just that it's the first thing people think about to be healthy, but that it's a large barrier that people internalize and see as unfeasible, and therefore they disengage with the healing process as a whole. Also, they tell you people will use you, and like bad people will use this to weaponize you. I'm unclear like why it's bad for people in your life who are too busy not to help you, or why bad people will like harm you any less or any more in the counterfactual. So the reason we outweigh them is because we actually prove why people will internalize this in the specific way that accesses their benefits. The path to majority of so the majority of people that they target are like somewhat not affected by this. We help the most vulnerable. We also fill in 2 vertical gaps. We beat CG because like, come on, what is their comparative? We can still access mental health in decentralized forms in our comparative. I think we just better help people who are actually trapped and have no choice. Proud to propose.
I thank Lip for a fine speech. As the manual instructs, and just to remind all speakers, POIs are an important part of the game and factor into close decisions. And indeed, the new manual penalizes you for speaks if you do not take POIs. But with that being said then, opposition whip whenever you're ready.
Okay, cool. Can you hear me?
Yes, you are perfectly audible and visible.
Wonderful. I'll take a POI verbally at some point. Let me get my timer. All right. Time starts in 3, 2, 1. Do you know what it feels like to grow up with deep, unsettled trauma? Do you know what it feels like to lose the person you would have died for? On both sides, there are coping mechanisms, sure, but the truth is that they were never enough. Because nothing can erase the sting of loss or the deep pain that you grew up with, but this narrative can help. I talk to you about 4 things. First, what did we tell you? There are 3 things here. First, we told you what this narrative would look like. That is a social valorization and normalization and legitimization of people prioritizing themselves, but specifically prioritizing what is valuable to them. We also told you that this narrative doesn't exist in a vacuum. I'll get on more of that later. The second thing we told you, it has how this narrative helps people. So first, as to normalizing what good mental health looks like, so people aspire to love themselves and this becomes something that is accepted, legitimized, and like valorized in society. But second, we told you how this increased social valorization for things like mandated vacation time and days off are happen because of this narrative, because more and more people believe that these are necessary for health. So it is worth the trade-off of like whatever worth the trade-off of like putting it on your ballot. It is worth the trade-off of going out and saying that I stand for this because you believe that it is necessary and that institutional change is important because this affects everybody as a whole. Another thing here is that it has a role model effect. That is, when powerful
POI.
celebrities talk about how loving themselves was really, really important to finding their identity, these lead to me as like interpreting it as like a small confidence boost that can lead to me taking bigger risks down the line, getting better opportunities, feeling better with myself. The next thing we told you is who this helps, as in people specifically with mental health issues, trauma, their post breakup or loss, because that is when you are most vulnerable to the power of a social narrative, because you're looking for something to comfort you. And we told you why it's unique and it's necessary, right? Because we told you about the existence of counter narratives, how the desire for external validation is biological, how there are biological urges to spiral and let yourself go. Because after a breakup, I'm not gonna shower for a week because I'm just so lost. And like people. And there are counter narratives that say that this is valid, this is healthy, you should keep doing this. And these are incredibly powerful, prevalent, and inherent. So, this necessity of our narrative is required as urgency to help the most vulnerable people, but also to get the institutional change that we told you about, the social valorization and the legitimization. I'll take the POI.
Yeah, be
Self-love
POI.
so
is
for real.
inherently about
Workplace rights came from this narrative. It came from people wanting more free time because free time is cool. Please prove tipping point. Also, the narrative that grieving exists on either side, and grieving is fine
Okay. You're
either
not
way.
putting two POIs in one. All right. So on this, I think the social valorization and legitimization to make you feel that these are necessary, that mental health, that loving yourself is necessary, it adds to a significant number of people who believe that this is something that is good. So that's how you get things like bipartisan support for this thing. That's how you get more support for this thing. So I don't have to prove a tipping point here. I just need to prove that there's more people believing that this is a good thing, which means that there are more people in the company who say that yes, we should trade off on productivity for more work days. And these people who are high up in like the chair, high up in like the board or whatever, it affects average people in a way that is significant, that affects people on the margins. Okay, let's talk about opening government. This is the second part of my speech. The first thing to tell you is that mental health is universal, isn't universal, that self-love is important for people, but not everybody. They don't prove this is true, and I am not sure why this is the case, because I want you to know that their definition of self-love is quite general, and that's the case because what we tell you is that self-love is inherently quite personal. That is, it's you doing what is right for you, whatever that may be. And you can see themselves that there is no universal imposition. And the proof that they give is that there are things that are biological and environmental. Those are the only two things that they say that affect this, that are mechanisms that affect your mental health. So on the biological thing, I think that if I have mental health issues, intense PTSD, when I engage with this narrative, and I'll prove later why it's going to be done well, I'm going to engage with it in a way that is personalized to me. So I will like see in the media strategies like whatever. It tells me to like shower regularly. It tells me to do something. It tells me to like engage in things that actually help me because that's how what I self-select into. But the second thing is on societal. So if I'm like stressed at work, perhaps what self-love means to me is to look for another job. If I'm a single mother, perhaps what self-love means to me is to drop the kids off at my friend's house because they're driving me crazy. But even if it is the case that some people benefit from the narrative, some people don't. I think that one, the people who benefit from this narrative are the people who perceive it the most. And this is the mechanism as to why it's going to be done well. Because the first reason is that there's a self-selection bias when it comes to interacting with narratives. So when I listen to songs that tell me to love myself, when I see content creators talk about the importance of self-love, perhaps they talk about strategies, but the types of strategies and the types of creators I'm engaging with are creators that are tailored to my interest because of the algorithm and because of the way that like social media works. So this beats the financial incentive reason from CG because the financial incentive comes from making content that is accessible to people and the algorithm spreads it and tailors it to the people who actually watch it. So if I'm depressed and I see a video on like a self-love and it's specifically tailored to like things that help people with depression and I look at it and I see, oh, I think this could be useful and you self-select into it. But the second thing is that people have friend groups who have similar experiences. So if I'm engaging with this narrative, the narrative that I find most convincing is probably what my friends are telling me. And if they have similar experiences, because that's what we bonded over, we became friends, I'm going to find those the most convincing, and those are the strategies that align with what is best for me. So the bottom line is people get more agency on our side, and people get to choose the narrative gets to be perceived well. I also think that the harms of the narrative that they say are quite weak. First, let's say that people like feel worse because loving yourself is the right reason. This is circular reasoning. If I prove to you that the narrative is perceived well, this point is gone. The next thing, Jazzy deals with say about toxicity, and I think this also deals with the OO claim on hurt people because they don't prove exclusivity. I'm not sure why people prone to unhealthy outlets are receptive to mental health narratives in the first place. On to CG. I think they say that this incentivizes people to first to be performative with their self-love. I actually don't think this is quite a bad thing that they talk about, because the way our brain works is that it responds to performative actions. So for example, if I hold a smile, I actually will feel happier. So I think this is the case that if more people do performative self-love, this has a spiraling effect and leads to them actually engaging in maybe a marginal bit of self-love, and then it's better than nothing. The second thing to say is you're going to be overconfident, which is bad because it gets punished. They throw an example, I'll throw one back. I think women are often only taken seriously in the workforce when they're able to be confident. So if confidence is something you want to claim, I think this helps these people more on scale. But even if they say that like people have body dysmorphia issues, people get hurt in the ways they say by this narrative, I think that trying to improve yourself through mental health means being critical of the problems in your life, which means that you need to love yourself in order to be receptive to this criticism, in order to be in the mind space to do this sort of inherent self-reflection and the criticism in the first place. So it is in your paradigm that this is better on our side. The final thing I want to do is deal with opening opposition. I think first we give you better mechanisms as to why the narratives were received well. That is what I told you about the self-selection of media and the nature of friends. This is better than the reason they give about crowding out negativity and reinforcing positivity, because those are quite vague and those may not apply in certain circumstances. But what we're telling you is that if you are someone vulnerable and involved and engaging with a social media narrative or a social narrative, you have social circles and you have social media, and that is the way it interacts with you.
Cool. I'd like to thank the opposition for a fine speech. As they close round, you won't get to know the call, the justifications for the call until after the break. Feel free to message me if you would like to know why the call is the way it is. Have a fun evening.